The map below shows the British Empire at its largest in the early 1920s. At that point, it was the largest empire the world had ever known. It contained around 450 million people, approximately 1/4 of the world's population, and it covered about 1/4 of the world's total land area. Today, the British Empire, now called the British Overseas Territories, is very small, consisting of a few small areas, mainly islands dotted around the world. At its height, the empire covered around 34 million square kilometres. Today, it covers around 1.7 million square kilometres. But what happened to the British Empire? Before the First World War, Britain was one of the richest countries in the world, with its mighty industrial power and vast empire. However, after 4 years of fighting, Britain's wealth was nearly all gone. It was now in debt, because Britain had borrowed money mainly from the USA. Also, during the war, many countries had been cut off from the supply of British goods, so had been forced to build up their own industries. They were no longer relying on Britain and directly competed with it instead. The First World War changed Britain's status in the world. It was no longer the world's economic superpower. After the war, Britain recovered some of its strength, but it was then completely bankrupted by the Second World War. Britain's economy was also beginning to change. Its trade with Europe and the USA became far more important than its trade with the countries of the empire. Britain was also no longer as important on the world stage, and it now overshadowed by political and financial might of the USA and the Soviet Union. By 1914, several of Britain's colonies, such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, had already been running their own affairs for several years. In 1922, Egypt became independent too. These countries and others in the empire played an important role in Britain's victory in both world wars by supplying troops and materials. However, by the end of the Second World War, many other British colonies were demanding independence or the right to rule for themselves. Britain no longer had the military strength or the wealth to hold on to them. Also, many British people felt that rebuilding Britain after the war was far more of a priority than holding on to distant colonies. And there are several reasons why there is an increasing demand for independence. The British style of education systems in some of the colonies meant that many people there were now becoming teachers, lawyers, and doctors. They'd learnt about democracy and freedom and wanted it for their own countries. The Africans and Indians who had fought for Britain felt they were fighting to defend freedom and were getting increasingly frustrated that their own countries were not free yet. They thought it was wrong that they should fight to stop the Nazi occupying other countries, but not fight to stop Britain occupying theirs. Some critics of the British rule argued that Britain seemed happier to allow self-rule to countries that contained a majority of white settlers, such as Australia and Canada. They suggested that British thought people of European descent, such as in Australia and Canada, were superior to non-Europeans. The demand for independence from the non-white colonies began to grow. Nationalist movements in Africa made it more difficult for the British government to keep power in Africa after 1948. One of the first countries they lost was in Asia in 1947, and it was India. In Ghana, there was a lot of unrest in 1948, particularly involving ex-students who were unhappy about their situation after the war. And in Kenya, the Mau Mau revolt drew a lot of British soldiers to the colonies in the 1950s to protect the white settlers. These security operations were expensive, and the British people lost interest in holding on to an empire in Africa. The economic schemes were not bringing in the profits expected, and the British people were more interested in spending public money on the new welfare state than funding for the empire. In 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan announced in Cape Town, South Africa, that there was a wind of change blowing through Africa that was bringing independence from the empire. The British government had accepted that decolonisation had Africa. In 1952, Egypt had a new nationalist government. After Indian independence, the next blow to the British Empire was going to be in the Suez Crisis. In 1956, Egypt's President Nasser took control of the British and French-owned Suez Canal. The canal was valuable to Britain as it was a gateway to the Middle East. When talks failed, the British and French troops landed in the canal zone, and Israel, an ally of the two countries, attacked Egypt overland. The whole world was shocked, and both the USA and the UN condemned their invasion. The troops were forced to withdraw, and Britain's Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, resigned in humiliation. The impact of the crisis was clear. Britain could no longer go to war to preserve their interests if the rest of the world disapproved. As a result, the British decided to allow independence in colonies they felt were stable and prosperous enough. They hoped that by freely granting independence, they were more likely to have a successful relationship with newly formed countries. Now, one place that we still today is the Falklands. Over the last 100 years, the British Empire has gradually got smaller, as more countries have begun to rule themselves. However, several small colonies dotted around the world did not leave and remain a part of the British Empire. One of these is a group of islands in the southern Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Argentina. In 1982, Britain fought a war to be able to defend these islands. In the early 1980s, Argentina was controlled by its army and its leader, General Galtieri. Argentina's economy was having severe problems at this time. Employment was high, banks were failing, and prices were rising quickly. Galtieri hoped that a quick, successful war that ended with the return of the Falklands to Argentina would take people's minds off their problems and restore belief in him. On the 2nd of April 1982, Argentine troops invaded the islands. About 12,000 soldiers arrived and they quickly took control. Most South American countries, except Colombia and Chile, supported Argentina's invasion and its claim to the islands. However, most of Argentina's troops were new recruits who were poorly trained. Britain's Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, responded quickly and defiantly. She said, "We have to recover these islands. We have to recover them, but the people on them are British and British stock, and we shall owe allegiance to the Crown and want to be British." She received no universal support from the politicians, and plans to retake the Falklands were up and running very soon. Britain sent a task force of over 100 ships and around 28,000 troops to the island, and declared a 320-kilometre exclusion zone around them. This meant that the British would, without any warning, open fire on any ship or aircraft entering the zone. Britain and Argentina were now at war, which ended on the 14th of June when the Argentines surrendered. In total, 750 Argentines and 255 British troops were killed during the war. However, the war did not end the dispute between the two countries. Argentina continues to claim the islands, but Britain maintains that it is not open to negotiation. To this day, the Argentinians always refer to the island in their language as their name. Around 1,000 British troops are posted there and are involved in patrolling the islands, as well as road building and monitoring the huge quantity of explosive mines that were planted there by Argentine forces during the conflict.